Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. We're so delighted you could join us today. We have a joint session co-hosted by SVDX as well as ACG. And today's session is Flying the Coop. Why are companies leaving Silicon Valley? And will there be regrets? I welcome you to learn more about our two organizations, SVDX as well as ACG. We offer a variety of programming and networking opportunities. You are welcome to visit our websites, www.svdx.org or www.acgsv.org. Today's session will be 1 hour in length. We welcome you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will also be recording the session, which will be available on our website after the fact. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Tom Campbell is a professor of economics and a professor of law at Chapman University. He was previously a tenured professor of law at Stanford University and tenured professor of business and dean of the Haas School of Business at Berkeley and dean of the Fowler School of Law at Chapman. He was a California state senator and also a United States congressman for 5 terms. Craig Tatlonghari is a partner with RSM US LLP. He also founded CT Tax, a boutique state and local tax consulting firm. Craig started his career as a tax auditor for the state of California and has extensive experience working in all areas of state and local taxation. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO, founder, and entrepreneur. He is currently chairman of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, chairman of SVDX, and a fellow at Stanford University. And with that, I will pass it on to Dan.
Great, thanks very much, Nancy. Very excited to be running this panel. As we mentioned, Bob will be joining us a little bit late, but it doesn't mean that we need to delay. I will mention something though, which many people may not have noticed, which is a good thing. We normally pride ourselves in how diverse our panels are, and this panel is very diverse, but not in gender. And I just want to make that note, which is we have a whole behind the scenes protocol for really making sure we build panels that are best and have lots of different types of people. For just any number of reasons, there are wonderful potential candidates for this panel who were women and couldn't make it. And so we have all men. But I will mention that the power behind the scenes, Nancy and several other folks, those in this case happen to be all women, and they're like the producers. So, they've played a role. I throw that out there because I want to be sensitive to that. So with that, I want to jump in and highlight 2 items. One, I feel like, and Tom, you've been around for a long time in Silicon Valley and playing in this ecosystem. And Craig, you have a career where you've been aware of it. But I feel like I've been to this rodeo at least twice, where people say, "Oh, everyone's leaving. It's all falling apart. It's gotten too hard to it." So I want to bring to my questions a bit of healthy skepticism. I'm open to the idea that it's different this time, and we should really take some lessons. But I'm also wondering if this is just part of a cycle that occurs. And so that's kind of my opening question to the both of you, which is, what is your take about what is happening? And we'll have some reference materials, of course, for people to click on later. But what is your take about what is happening? And is it transient? Is it cyclical? Or does it represent, in your mind, something more important, more profound in Silicon Valley and maybe even California in general? And Craig, you want to go first? Kind of give us a quick take on that?
Oh, shoot. I was hoping Tom would go first, but all right, I'll go on a limb and say I think it is different, Dan. Yeah, obviously the world is different. The issues we're facing are unprecedented. We've heard all the terminology with the pandemic and whatnot. But when you look at actual hard data, and maybe it's not the mass exodus that people are portraying, but the data speaks for itself. Department of Finance said for the first time since the 1900s, the California population has dropped. It's not huge. It was, I think, 180,000 net decrease. And so that's new. 8 of the 9 Bay Area counties have experienced also drops in population. So that's new. Working remotely and having companies actually truly exploring a remote workforce and have that be a long-term proposition or a permanent proposition, that's new as well. But how much of this is going to create this mass exodus that people are portraying. I think that part may be a bit inflated. Yeah.
Great. Well, the data is a kind of a foundation, is very helpful. So it is worth noting that the population movement data is there. It's specific. I like following the U-Haul numbers, the U-Hauls that come in versus the U-Hauls that go out. And it's a simple back of the envelope, but it's pretty telling. It's at its most divergent ever. So Tom, what's your take about this time around? Is it really different? Are there some aspects we should pay more attention to? What do you think?
Let me start. Thank you, Dan, and thanks for having me on the panel. Let me start with a couple of positives that remain. So this possibility that it isn't all that different is bolstered by the fact that there is no Taiwan Strait in Silicon Valley. That's to say, we have the influx of Americans whose parents or who themselves came from Taiwan, China, Singapore, from the diaspora of Chinese population, and collaborate, bring tremendous strength to our innovation and invention in Silicon Valley. Similarly, there's no Pakistan-India fight. We draw from the subcontinent, and we are tremendously benefited by brilliant, hardworking innovators, entrepreneurs. I think that culture remains. I've not seen signs that that has changed, despite the fact that the world has changed with the Taiwan-China situation particularly. So, and then similarly, great universities. San Jose State, Santa Clara, Stanford, UC Berkeley, those are not going anywhere. Those attract brilliant students and brilliant professors, and the spin-offs are tremendous. On Page Mill Road, you've got the best proof of that, the Hewlett-Packard, who met at the Stanford Engineering School under Donald Terman. And you've got one street that's Donald and the other it's called Terman, right off Page Mill. But there are some things that have changed, and picking up something we might return to on the political side, I think the political environment is different. So when I was first a professor at Stanford, Pete McCloskey was very active. Moderate wing of the Republican Party was vibrant. Pete was succeeded by Ed Shao. This kind of Republican is gone. And I was the last Republican to represent the Silicon Valley in Congress or in the state legislature. And now I'm not a Republican. I left the Republican Party of the nomination of Donald Trump. So that is a significant change. And then secondly, in my opinion, Democratic and Republican have both increased their orthodoxy. That's to say, a candidate or an incumbent is punished for straying from the party line. So you get results that I really don't think are beneficial for business, but nevertheless are beneficial for the base of the two parties' orthodoxy. And that is a recent development.
That's great, and that's a good start. So we've got a lot of moving parts, and I think drawing from both of you, there's a lot of things that remain the same and strong and are not reasons call out that the sky is falling. But on the other hand, there's some real changes underway, and maybe we dig into those a little bit. I will be, by the way, so if anyone who's listening has a question, please do post it into the questions, because I will incorporate those questions into our conversation as we go along. And so maybe I'll highlight a question that came up, and I think we'll revisit it a bit. There's an issue about what about the movement of people is relevant, like who, what type of profile. I will speak to one part of it. Those of you who know me well, I have a past life as an immigration lawyer and expert, and I chair the American Immigration Council. And it's interesting to note that the folks departing California do not fit the profile of immigrant founders of companies. That's an interesting point. So building on the Anglo-Saxonian work that I did with Vivek Wadhwa, it is clear that those who are departing are not the profile of those who came here, went to school, worked as in a technology company space, and then tend to form their own company. Those are not the folks that are leaving. So that, for me, that was relevant and is important. So let me ask you, though, a different question that relates to that, and we'll come back to it. And that is, what is changing that isn't about necessarily the politics, the taxes, the regulation, or the housing, that maybe is a part of this bigger trend of flexibility to work from different places, flexibility to have a dispersed virtual company. So what are the elements that maybe are converging, some would argue, that enable these changes? So technology is an easy one, but I wonder if you think there's cultural shifts in attitude. Maybe let's talk about that a little bit before we hop to the more nitty gritty of taxes, housing, and
Yeah, maybe if I could jump in on this one first. I saw a change even before the pandemic as I served the technology clients in and around the Bay Area. There was one in particular that struck me as kind of a eye-opening experience. I'm by no means a millennial, I'm far from it now, but I always prided myself in kind of being like really a tech aficionado. I was kind of a closet geek, built my own PCs and did all that. Went out to one of these startup companies and we were having meetings, and this startup company is now kind of a darling of the Bay Area. And what struck me was at these meetings, the culture of the people was, we don't physically need to be in the same room to have an effective meeting. In fact, as I attended more and more meetings, it was not uncommon to have people sitting in the office next door to the conference room that we were in, but opted to Zoom in or WebEx in because they just found it more productive for them to be behind. This is pre-pandemic, and the founders of the company, they didn't push back on that cultural style. In fact, they try to make it as transparent as easy as possible with as little friction as possible for people to work how they best felt comfortable and effective. And the culture really was, hey, if you want to be in your office and not come to the conference room down the hallway, by all means, as long as you're at the meeting and participating and engaged. So I started to see a little bit of that, and it's not really, it was technology enabled, but it was also really cultural from a kind of a top-down mindset.
Got it. Tom, how about your thoughts on this?
I think Greg's absolutely right, and I can add to it from the academic world. So I was a professor at Stanford for 19 years, and I moved across the Bay to Berkeley for 6. Part of my time as a professor, when I joined the faculty in 1983, there was a real culture of professors walking into each other's offices, going out for a froyo near Hutau. And so this physical visiting, checking out, what are you doing, began to dissipate. And it dissipated over all of my 19 years at Stanford, and even more so when I became dean at the School of Business at Berkeley. You didn't visit professors. You could walk down the corridor and it would be as silent as a monastery outside of Vespers. And you've got this, I don't need to talk because I can email. I think the advent of email was a huge element in this. So I validate what Greg said relative to the growing irrelevance of physical meeting. And that's terrible in my judgment because of serendipity. The ideas that came out of just running into somebody at in the lounge, in the faculty lounge at Stanford was superb. And you didn't have that at the end of my time. And at Berkeley as well. I remember getting faculty to attend meetings was exceptionally difficult. So loss of synergy, and that was on the academic side. Another point I'd make is manufacturing. So this trend also pre-pandemic, but there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of literature of learning to innovate by watching manufacturing. That invention is many times stimulated by observing the actual process. And there's a place for the theorists, Lord knows, but a lot of learning is gained by watching the manufacturing, and manufacturing had moved out. There's no more wafer fabs in California. And yet that's how the Silicon Valley really started, with high tech and the actual manufacturing. So the immigration of manufacturing, I think, is irreversible. Lots of reasons for that, including the regulatory and tax issues, but also the people who you get to work in manufacturing are not at the very highest level. And so they can't afford the cost of living in the Bay Area. So they'll move out to Utah, move out to Texas, and the top engineers and CEO, C-suite folks will stay in Silicon Valley, won't see the manufacturing, and they won't have those serendipitous conversations. I think Bill Hewlett and David Packard.
So it's interesting, Tom, you've touched on a couple of questions that are popping up about flexibility. Let me ask a few follow-ups and incorporate that. So maybe a little bit about technology. Are there elements of the recent developments in technology? And Craig, I'm drawn to the fact in your story that Zoom has become more and more functional and more readily available, and that seemed to enable part of the culture you described in your company. I will mention, the company that I built and ran and ultimately sold to Thoma Bravo. We started in Silicon Valley, but grew frustrated for a variety of reasons and moved almost everything to Phoenix, Arizona. We kept an obligatory Silicon Valley office, of which I was a part, but really, most of our people and most of the heart, we eventually said the headquarters of the company, unless we were talking to someone on Sand Hill Road, was in Phoenix. And we had this ability to do that. And that was now a few years ago. And we had these virtual walls where we, run, interactive cameras all the time. And that was a little bit clunky and hard to do, but it seems easier to do now. How much does that matter in today's environment? Do you think the technology, Tom, to your point, you're worried about the absence of serendipity, of people running into each other, bumping in the halls and talking about their kids and then saying, by the way, I'm Project X, have you thought about this? I had this crazy idea last night. Maybe to both of you, is technology going to be a substitute for that? A little, a lot, not at all? That's a false placement of trust in technology solving everything. What do you think?
Well, I'll start off because I know less. That will allow Craig to have more time because he knows more. No, for what I was describing, technology is not the answer. I know there are ways that could be. You have a mandatory open chat session where everybody must be participating, and you know what happens. People will do their email or be operating their Twitter account. So no, making it available is not the same as serendipity, and technology has not created that opportunity.
Yeah, to your point, Tom, anecdotally, it is still, for most people, culturally rude to be standing in a hallway and talking to them and start doing something on your phone. That is still a norm. You're not really supposed to do that. Whereas I don't think it's considered blatantly rude to multitask. It's frowned on, I think, when you're interacting in even just a 2 or 3 person, Zoom environment. So it's an interesting culture shift. But Craig, I don't know if you have a more positive view of the role of technology, or if you share the view of Tom.
I share the view of Tom, but my teenage and now college sons will correct me and say that I don't get it. They actually interact using social media and all of the chatter tools, the texting the same times, much in the same way as people would analogize, like walking into an office and bumping into someone. They bump each other online, they bounce things off of each other all times of day. They feel like they are more responsive and able to carry on more tasks at the same time. How effectively, I guess that's always the big debate. But they say that's just, their relationships that they forge with folks that they may not have met in person. They value those as much as they do the in-person relationships. And that's really foreign to me, right? I mean, I'm so used to having face-to-face, let's have drinks, let's play a game, let's do something together. But they're doing that in a virtual world, and for them it's just as real and just as important as how we grew up.
May I jump in for just a second to say I'm teaching young men and women of your children's age, Greg.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the particular device that we use, Canvas, at Chapman University, I can tell when a student's typing. And I'm thinking, oh, they're going to send me a question. No question. They're typing to somebody else. And there's a number of times, I won't say necessarily at Chapman, I will say, however, in my experience, a large number of times where I call on a student and say, well, what, respond to Nancy's point, respond to Joe's point, and say, would you mind restating it? So I think your sons just possibly might be deceiving their father.
Yeah,
Be on the wrong side of this generational divide. Like I'm unwilling to admit that at this point. I don't like to think of myself as that old, but it is interesting that you highlight, both of you, Craig and Tom, that there is a generational difference of opinion that has been surveyed and well demonstrated. And intriguingly, Tom, what has started to happen is the development of technology tools to make up for the distraction is moving apace as quickly as the technology itself. So I'm told by my college age kid that the thing you do is you run a real-time transcript, so that if you get called on in that way, you can look up real quick at the transcript that's been running and you can see what was said. You don't have to say, oh, sorry, I didn't hear you. But this poses a question that I think Mark Lonergan asked, and I want to ask it to us directly, which is, in light of the big picture trends, in light of COVID's disruption, in light of these technologies, and maybe a certain feeling about the power of the technology to solve problems we've thought of as hard to solve with technology. If you were, say, 22 or 23, so you've got your undergraduate degree, maybe you're between that period of time where you might go get a graduate degree, but you want to get a great job, would you relocate if you weren't here? Would you come and work in Silicon Valley as a 22 or 23-year-old, or would you try to, engineer a way to not have to come to Silicon Valley? Because I'm not asking the question, would you or would you not want to work for Google or Facebook, or the next Google or Facebook? Let's take that as a probable yes. But would you try to avoid coming to Silicon Valley? What do you think? It's a hard one. I'll let Craig go first.
yeah, it's a hard one because my mindset knows what it knows now, being the age I am. And I try to put myself back to, if I were in my early 20s, how would I view Silicon Valley and the opportunities that are here? There was a time where it was extremely unique what we had in the Silicon Valley, and I absolutely would. There was nothing that would have kept me away. That said, now you kind of look out at what's happening in some of these other tech centers around the country, and it's becoming compelling to be there. And when you layer on top of that the cost of living differences, I think that's huge. I talk to folks now starting off their careers, and many of them, they're crammed 4 deep in a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, making great money, but struggling to get ahead. And for them, they feel like it's just a temporary proposition. And so I have a hard time kind of connecting those dots because I don't live in that reality anymore. And if I were a young 20-something looking at the prospects, I might feel differently.
What's interesting, Craig, and I'm going to ask Tom to weigh in on this because it'll be a nice segue to some of the housing and other questions. You've identified something that we know and is well demonstrated in like Federal Home Loan Bank circles. So housing cost sensitivity of gainfully employed college graduates in their early 20s who are unmarried and have no children is actually, the sensitivity is pretty low because of what you described. Right? They're kind of like, okay, but I'll get to be in San Francisco. Maybe I'll be crammed into a tiny apartment, but it won't last forever. And I just want to get there, right? Which is very, very different from the 31-year-old married with a toddler, right? And that's a much higher sensitivity to housing costs in a lot of different ways. So we know that. I'll throw that data out there. But maybe Tom, what's your thinking about the young up and coming professional? Maybe we divide it for debate circumstances, single and really just young and free in a way that they don't appreciate, right? The youth is wasted on the young kind of thing versus others. So what do you think about Mark Lonergan's question? Would you, as a 22-year-old, still try to come here despite whatever perceptions you might have?
Well, my perception comes from my students. So my students in economics, my students in law, and when I was at Berkeley, my students in business, they want to stay. So yes, there are alternatives. There are more alternatives now than there were 30 years ago. Austin, Texas seems to be attractive. I remember when Sematech was located in Austin, Texas. Bob Noyce, I was in Congress then. Bob was active in that move, and I asked him why, and he said because of the regulatory environment, because of the housing costs, But Bob stayed in Silicon Valley. And so I would say, no, there's still that strong attraction. And I want to add a humanistic element to it. And that is, where can I go where I'm judged on the basis of what I do, what I can do, and not on the basis of who my parents were, what my race is, what country I was born in. Those are phenomenally important in attracting and retaining people. And we still have that in Silicon Valley. I don't know if that's the case in alternative venues. And before giving an intelligent answer, I should have to say, as compared with what? As compared with Phoenix, as compared with Seattle, and then you'd have to do some kind of a study. My own sample of graduate students in business, economics, and law, Silicon Valley is still very attractive. And for that reason, it's a place where you are an individual and judged as such.
So this brings us maybe to kind of the brass tacks part of some of the mechanics of what seems to be at least highlighting the debate that people have about, leaving, and also what a lot of CEOs and others invoke as some of the reasoning. So I want to break those into parts, but I want to start with housing in part because we've gotten a couple of questions along those lines, both in the Q&A chat that you see and everyone sees, I think, and then also in the private chats. So it goes something like this, which is, I think last week, the median house price in California hit a new record. Silicon Valley is that, times 1.3 or something. And housing by any measure is very, very expensive. This has obviously direct effects of people's ability to afford a house that they might like. It's particularly challenging if they come from a lower housing cost environment to a higher costing housing environment because of kind of the shock of it all. But it also is relevant to the capacity to have support services around them. So the ability to have someone care for your children if you have children and you're professional, you need daycare. It has all these knock-on effects, which we understand. So my question is, and questions from others is, what is the cost of living? But let's focus on housing for a moment. Where is that playing into this phenomena? And certainly we're going to come to some ideas and solutions, but let's talk about housing. How does it fit in? Is it a little piece, a big piece, dominant, overblown? What do you think?
Well, I'll start and yield to Craig for more depth of analysis. You got to start with the tax situation. So when we adopted Prop 13, strongly support and want to see maintained. It's one of our few positives in attracting and retaining business. But when we did, we shifted the revenue sources from local to state. And so real estate taxes imposed by the local jurisdiction were no longer going to balance the budget. So local jurisdictions began to impose impact fees instead. And this would mean any developer has to pay a price up front, a price in a set aside, a price in particular units at an affordable level. And by the end of that, the cost of affordable housing was no longer affordable. When I was a state senator, I was very privileged to be chairman of the Housing and Local Government Committee of the State Senate. And I really learned that lesson. So it is here to stay. And the consequence is then felt on those for whom the cost of housing has gone up because the cost imposed by the local government, the planning commission, the city council has added to that above their ability to. And thus mid-level, to the extent that you can put a manufacturing plant outside the state, you will, the folks at the very top can and do pay. One of my colleagues will remain nameless in the state Senate, a leader on the other side of the aisle, said, oh, they always complain about taxes, but they never move. They, in his concept, were not the manufacturing people, obviously, because they do move.
And we'll come back to the Prop 13 kind of math and mechanics, I think, which is probably underweighted a little bit, but I'll ask Craig to weigh in first, and then we can kind of circle back around if that's okay, Tom.
Yeah. On the housing situation and how that I think is impacting decisions being made. I think it is. I've been dealing with it firsthand with a lot of our younger staff. Maybe not the youngest of the young staff, but kind of that manager, like heavy senior manager role, where they are at that point in their life where they're ready to lay down roots and start a family and build a family. And a lot of them were saying, I can't do it here. And with, you know, with the solutions that our firm made available, like, you know, working remotely, et cetera. And then you layer on just the lack of some of the social benefits that being in a place like San Francisco or Silicon Valley provided, especially with the you know, the government mandated shutdowns, et cetera. They were saying it just doesn't make sense, and they're gonna at least test the waters moving somewhere else for a little while. But we're having conversations now where they don't want to come back, and you know, they kind of had this taste of what it's like to be a manager earning manager level wages, or heavy senior level wages in another part of the country where perhaps the spending power of that is a lot more impactful. And they kind of feel like, hey, you know, what they're telling me at least is, you know, I work hard and I work really hard, and I suddenly, you know, for the last 18 months felt like I'm able to enjoy the benefits of that labor, not feel like I'm kind of just, you know, part of the many. I feel like I'm getting ahead, and that's kind of an interesting insight that they're sharing with me now that I never really connected, you know, being, you know, here in the Bay Area for over 20, 25 years.
Now, let me ask a follow-up question to that. I mean, clearly, let's make clear, this is a profoundly, as they say, first world problem, right? But
Yeah.
In the Bay Area, if you are a dual income household, both professionals, both working at a top tier firm of one sort or another, it would not be unusual that your household income is between $300,000 and $700,000 a year. That's not an unusual pattern to see if you have two professionals. And yet, when you survey that profile of individual in the Bay Area, they will say that they are, you know, solidly middle class and do not feel particularly wealthy, and sometimes feel like they're clinging to that status. Now, the numbers say otherwise with certainty, right? Because there's actually a lot of wealth there. They might own a house and they're disturbed by the fact that they have a $2 million mortgage, which, like, to anyone and say their parents in the Midwest, they're like, you have borrowed what? What have you done? But their home might be worth $3.5 million, right?
Right.
So let's not mistake wealth versus, but they don't feel it, to your point.
Right.
And so that's maybe my follow-up question, which is, there's the reality, then there's the reality of how people feel about it. And how people feel about things can be sort of contagious and viral. And that's my question, which is, what do you think is the perception next around housing? And then we'll switch to regulation stuff. But what do people think, in your opinion, correctly or incorrectly, is going to happen with housing? And I will start by saying, I talk to a lot of CEOs, and CEOs tend to say something like the following: I'm no Google, I'm no Facebook. I cannot bend the curve in terms of creating housing units where my people need to be. And now that they are in fill in the blank, Tucson, Arizona, Boise, Idaho, wherever, I just feel powerless to solve this housing. So there's an at least anecdotal feeling of, it's a big problem, it's getting worse, I can't solve it. If that's true, it feels like it bodes badly for this trend. I wonder if you agree with that anecdotal observation, or if you have maybe a counterpoint. And then we will get to solutions for sure. So I don't want to leave all those hanging. But Tom, I'll give you the option to go first on that, if you like.
Sure. I want to speak about the trajectory. I think you accurately described the status quo. So in quantum mechanics terms, let's talk about the vector, and that's the development is not optimistic. One of the questions in the chat from Bella talks about a single party state and more than the cost of living. Yeah, looking at the politics, one would have to say there's nothing that's going to change this. There are occasional bills mandating that a certain amount of housing be built along a transportation corridor. And those are very controversial and highly skeptical as to whether they're going to be affordable, even if they are built along a transportation corridor. The motivation there appears to be green, not affordable housing. In other words, let's reduce the cost of transportation. So what are the primary focuses of the legislature? It is a single party state. And the focus is going to be more on environment than on keeping businesses. The two are not antagonistic, but look, you can have one priority. That's the definition of the word priority. So I don't see the trajectory changing. I see the focus on what maintains the orthodoxy and maintaining sympathy for the couple that you just described, Dan. A couple whose joint income is over $500,000, there's no sympathy in the legislature for that couple. Certainly not in the party that dominates it. Let me be pointed here. I have to be in order to talk about the solution. 77.5% of the state Senate is one party. 77.5% of the state Senate. 75% of the state Assembly is one party. If that party is not going to change, this problem is not going to be resolved.
Well, I always look to you for the optimistic view, Tom. I didn't get it this time, so I'm gonna ask Craig if you have a view on this, and then we'll move on to some of the other items, and then switch gears into some creative or not so creative solutions. Yeah, Craig, go ahead. Did you want to weigh in on the perception and trajectory issue?
Yeah, I don't know that I have much more to add beyond that. It doesn't seem to be getting better, and I just look anecdotally at what's happening, around in my neighborhood, and, houses are still going like hotcakes. And, so someone lists a house, and before it even hits the MLS, it's sold. And so our realtors, you look at those flyers you get in the mail, and they actually don't have any inventory to list. They just say what they sold. So I think people are still buying in. And it's keeping the prices high. Although you mentioned earlier the U-Haul kind of test, right? What's happening with U-Haul, and you talk, some of the data points we have from that industry, it shows we are seeing a net exodus still, more people moving out than moving in. So the question then is, people that are buying these houses, are they just kind of moving around the California Bay Area, California, and not really coming from outside in? What's happening, or is it foreign investment? Is it people going to set up a virtual bed and breakfast and cash in? All of these things start to weigh into the different dynamic that we're facing, as a community.
Dan, may I jump in with one
Indeed,
extra
of course.
fact? Excellent point, Craig, and I certainly validate it. Last November, there was a ballot initiative to undo Prop 13 relative to commercial and industrial. So it's called a split roll. It failed, but only by 4 points. 48% of the voters were willing to abandon the protection on property tax for commercial and industrial. How can you look at that and be optimistic on the political scene? Now, I've got some optimistic things we might get to in a moment, but relative to that, and the second thing I wanted to, Craig, just because I didn't want to run out of time without saying so, absolutely importantly, I should have mentioned Becky Morgan as well as in the mold of the moderate, pro-business, pro-growth, pro-employment kind of Republican who used to have sway in Sacramento in the days when the budget required Republican votes. Now the budget does not require Republican votes. So I missed Becky when I was referring to Ed Chow and Pete McCloskey. And so I've adjusted that observation.
We'll probably come back to as part of the solutions or non-solutions, the single party state function, politically speaking, in terms of what's on the table for possible changes. Let me maybe circle back around to the regulation part, although I want to put a pin in a summary of what you just described for the housing and some of the problems. So when we come to solutions, we mention it again, and that is in the same way. I'm actually, Tom, I'll admit this, a friend recently said, Tom Kimball, isn't he like the better/best version of you, Dan? I'm like, thanks so much for that, but it was meant to be flattering, which is I'm about to put on my economist hat, but of course we overlap for a hot minute at Stanford, and I'll let you jump in if you think I get this wrong, but it's important to recognize in the same way that we say the map is not the territory, the stock market is not the economy, the housing market as we read it in headlines and sales and movement is not the housing environment as the entire population experiences it. These are very different things. They're obviously connected, but the housing in California should not be defined by what we see as the movement of inventory stock and the increase of prices in a single place. That is not the robust description of housing. And I mention that because I think we're going to come back to that as some of the solutions here. But let's move on to regulation. So when we talk jokingly, SVDX does lots of different things. We have to do webinars. We do these very limited, like a cap of 10 directors, exchange sessions. And something really weird has happened in the last year. And that is, we have several regulars on those exchange sessions, but several of them, the backdrop would change. And we get together enough that we recognize, I'd be like, hey, where are you now? And they would say, oh, I'm in my new house and I'm like, oh, wow, is that a vacation home? Are you renting it for the COVID? And they're like, no, I moved. And I would ask, well, why? And for this cohort, the answer was typically taxes and regulation issues, right? And they were moving either some or all of their businesses or they themselves. So where does that fit in? I do know people who, as their income increases, they notice there's this thing called state income tax, and they're like, oh, that's actually material, right? A good day when your taxes are material. And they start saying, is there a place where you don't pay that, right? And they're like, look, Nevada doesn't have it. So where do the taxes and regulation issues come in? CEOs tend to talk more about the regulations, of course, and individuals more about the taxes. How relevant is that? Maybe Craig, you get to go first on this one, and then we'll let Tom.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, my specialty is state and local tax. I've been having more conversations these days with business executives, both from a business perspective and from an individual circumstance perspective, about moving out of California than I have in 25 plus years of practice. It's always been something that folks considered, but the speed or just the volume of which people are having kind of this thought process and really wanting to explore it, like seriously explore it and start running models and evaluating all of the different site selection criteria that people usually look at. It really is kind of striking, and it's not unique. I talk to other practitioners, and they're all having the same conversations.
Yeah, that's and it's funny. I have a cousin, it's my wife's cousin, who recently sent an email and said, hey, Dan, you and Holly, Nashville, or come to Nashville. Tennessee doesn't have state income tax anymore, right? So that it's part of the kind of conversation now that families apparently use to other parts of their family to try to get them, to move. So Tom, what do you think? How much is that weighing in, and where does it go?
It's huge, and it's not getting any better. I do hope we get to the optimistic end of this conversation, Dan. It's not. Here's the wealth tax. A wealth tax was introduced in the last legislative session. It's introduced again, seriously being put forward by the leadership of the monopoly party in the legislature, and it's a clawback. So if you want to escape the wealth tax, oh no, because we're going to go back for the last 10 years and tax you on the wealth you've accumulated when you were in California. How can you better advertise, please leave our state, than to say, if you have been a success here, we will tax not your income, over which you might have some cash flow control, but your wealth, which might be invested in fluctuatable, immediately marketable investments. Wealth tax is one. Percentage on boards. If you are a California a company headquartered in California, you must have a certain percentage of your board who are women, gay, lesbian, or minority race. I think there's a serious constitutional problem with that, by the way, that the state would give preference on the basis of race or any of those categories. But it didn't seem to bother the monopoly in Sacramento. I mean, if you took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, that includes the 14th Amendment that says that no state shall impose a unequal protection of the laws. And here you have unequal protection of the laws. One group is favored. We're broadcasting this orthodoxy. These are the folks who are going to be setting the regs. When I was a state senator, I introduced a simple bill that we have a sunset of all existing regulations, that it'd be a rotating sunset, but after 15 years, it'll come off unless it's been repromulgated. And since it's 15 years, it's a lot of lead time, and didn't get past the first committee hearing. Because the interests that were behind the regulations were exactly the constituencies that supported the political majority. So those are all instances where the situation now is bad, and the trajectory is worse.
Yeah. Tom, you mentioned the wealth tax, but there's also the income tax that's being proposed. The income tax increase. There's a bill right now to raise the top rate in California to what was it, 16.8%. 16.8% on the top earner. So that would bring the overall top tax rate, both federal and state, north of 54%. that's, that really is, talk about bad trajectory and, going from bad to worse, that and the wealth tax, they really are saying, hey, don't let the bridges hit you if you leave,
And it is interesting, both Craig and Tom, that, we mentioned a little while ago that there's not a lot of sympathy for that dual income professional couple, which, at least in my view, in Silicon Valley is sort of the bread and butter heart of these operating companies, right? So they're often not the founder, obviously, but they are making these places run, right? Maybe one's the lawyer and one's an engineer, whatever it may be. Well, in the same way that there's no sympathy for those, I do think it's sort of a personal relativist litmus test. If you said, Craig, that income tax was only for $20 million of annual income or higher, I know that's not the proposal, but if it were, like, the vast majority of people would be like, well, that one's okay, right? Because they don't imagine themselves hit by that, which of course is sort of the nature of the challenge of taxes. And so my question is, and this will be, let's segue into like some solutions and the like. What can be done? And we can come back to the taxes in particular, though it feels like that's a complicated political thing. And it's odd. I'm normally the middle of the road guy in almost everything I moderate. I feel like I'm inadvertently a little bit on the left on this one, which is unusual for me, which is fine. That's good. But let me ask a big question and then ask you to highlight some solutions. We've mentioned things in the questions, both private chat and otherwise. First, should California, should Silicon Valley, should all of these power players just say, you know what, the world changes. I cannot stand against the tide. I should, maneuver into taking advantage of what I can and, doing what Silicon Valley does, but just acknowledge that it's going to be different in terms of where people choose to live. And so what I mean by that is, don't try to fix everything so that you somehow have your people in a headquarters that's California. But if you think Silicon Valley has a secret sauce, well, then craft clever ways of assembling a virtual company, having a certain part of the company here. Like, just go with the flow and be smart. Don't fight the tide. That's a question about, like, is that the solution? Sort of a non-solution, but Silicon Valley has reinvented itself in a variety of different ways over time. This maybe is just a version of that. So that's one question. Let me pause there, and then I want to get into like specifics. But what about that as a view, which is this whole debate is silly. Like, we cannot change demographic trends, live with it, optimize around it, and move on. I hear that a lot.
I don't want to become Connecticut. Thanks. I don't want to have two classes of people, the wealthy and those who work for them at a domestic level, the wealthy and those who are butlers. God bless butlers. I'm not putting anybody down for that profession, but that's and it's unfair to Connecticut what I just said. But you get my drift. No, the vibrancy of the vibrancy. I do not anticipate running in the state of Connecticut in the near future. But the prospect of hollowing out the energy, the creativity, the manufacturing has already been hollowed out, is too real. So no, I will not go softly into that. Dark night, is that the phrase?
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, Tom, that's a great.
I will rage.
So
rage
it's
against the dying of the light.
Yeah, it's a social viewpoint, and I think it's well rooted in kind of American democracy, right? Which is, there are developing countries, many of which are southern neighbors, who have strived mightily to get out of that, binary arrangement where you have elites and you have kind of everyone else who's well below the middle, and they're trying to build the middle. And you don't want to have a California where there's essentially, you never meet a firefighter at a PTA meeting. You never actually bump into the nurse practitioner down the street at the coffee shop because they don't live there, right? They either live far away and they come in, or So I hear that, and I think that's a really good reason not to fight it. But Craig, what's your take on that? By the way, I vote for that social optimal strategy, but how do we get there?
Yeah, I think innovation is going to be the key here. I think taking a lot of that innovative brain power that we have and that we apply towards products, applying that towards the business is what's really going to help companies hit this head on. We saw it a lot during the go-go days of all the tech companies competing with who has the better perks, who has the better cafeterias, who has the better gyms and office setup. Figuring out a way to do that in a virtual environment, I think, is what's gonna be the next phase of this. Marrying up the reality of a diversified workforce with building culture, and figuring out a way to appeal to the next generation. I think that's going to be how companies are, it is different. We adapting to it is going to be key, but really not just going easily and kind of going along with the flow, but being proactive and trying to figure out what are the things that we could look into. Is it virtual reality? These new technologies that are on the edge, rather than wait to see what happens, maybe take the lead and make what happens.
So let me ask maybe some specifics around that, which is, so what are some of the solutions therefore to housing in light of the problem that we have, and maybe give us odds on a more palatable outcome around taxation discussions. And Tom, there's a specific question that says, what are the chances of this wealth tax happening, which is worth it. So what do you propose as a constructive step, either for political policy players listening, of which there are a few, by the way, or CEOs contemplating this difference? And I'll summarize so far where we're at is some hybrid version is probably inevitable because you're already there, right? COVID forced your hand.
Yeah.
Secondly, technology will play a role, maybe a big role for some companies. Sounds like these next generation, younger companies, embrace it from the beginning up, and hence it's a little bit easier. But if you have this vision that Silicon Valley and presence matters, coming together matters, serendipity matters, and you acknowledge that at least in the next 5 or 10 years, you can't perfectly substitute with technology, then what do you do in terms of solutions that we've identified as critical, which is housing, tax policy, and a couple other things? So what can be done? Tom, I'll let you go first on that, because I know you've kind of spent a lifetime working on that. So
Thank you, Dan. Cap impact fees. Cap the ability of local government to extort payments which eventually immediately make housing unaffordable. Second, revise the state tax system, and you don't have to reinvent this. Barry Parsky did this. There's the Parsky Commission, which was bipartisan, really thoughtful, came up with a comprehensive solution to our huge variability of tax because of capital gains. Go back and pick that up and implement it. Third, if you can't even do that, at the very least, make filling out a California income tax form a postcard. Here's how much I paid federal. Here's the percentage. Send it in. Don't spend the extra 2 days or day and a half, I guess is the average time spent filling out a California income tax form. Number 4, don't give up on California politically. There are initiatives which can succeed. The people do speak through initiatives. And if it takes an initiative to put a cap on impact fees or to restructure our tax system, so be it. It's hard for Republicans ever to vote for a tax increase, but there are taxes that make sense, like carbon tax, for example, instead of cap and trade, or an increased expanded consumption tax, as opposed to a tax on investment, depending where you are in the business cycle. So the initiative process has a future. And my optimism there is that Prop 16 was defeated. Californians proudly hold that we are not going to judge you on the basis of your race for admission to UC or for getting a government contract. We're not going to allow you race or gender, national origin to be a factor in whether you get into Berkeley or UCLA. And the Democratic leadership put on the ballot without a single signature, just because they can do so with better than 2/3 of the legislature. They put on the ballot to repeal that in last November. It failed by 14 points. So the people will respond. And then lastly, I believe the Republican label is poison in the state of California. I don't think it's revivable in my lifetime. So I've been trying to develop a third party, a new party. And I'm bolstered by the fact that the data are strongly in favor of it. The Public Policy Institute of California most recent poll says 56% of all Democrats want the third party, 53% of all Republicans, 75% of all independents, 61% of all likely voters want a new party. So I've been working on the Common Sense Party, and pardon me for making the one plug, but please look it up, cacommonsense.org, cacommonsense.org. The Republican Party can't do it anymore. But there's a lot of people who are worried at the leftward drift and the insistence on orthodoxy on the Democratic Party side. So is there another way? Yes, there is another way. So those are my hopefully
Those are great,
optimistic.
Tom. And I'm going to let Craig weigh in. I will mention something which is interesting and it's evident in the data. There's a lot of great work from Stanford and every other higher education institution on this because there's great interest in it. In the realm of political opinion, the populace, which is all of us, the people, if you can get past the first 2 minutes, it turns out that on average, we're kind of practical centrists. Like it's not obvious and it doesn't feel that way, but if you, and the great data, for example, is on immigration. So there's strong feelings about immigration. It's a tough problem. Reasonable people disagree strongly, but when you peel it back and you talk to real people for about 10 or 15 minutes, it's remarkable how centrist-ish everyone is. I kind of land in the middle. And to your point, Tom, it feels like California could embrace that. And we hear that a lot. And I want to apologize to people who've asked questions. There's a lot about, wealth creation, inequalities generating from tech that deserve attention. And there's probably a session up and coming about that. We just didn't have time, but I want to let you, Craig, highlight a couple solutions. And then I'll ask like one cap off question, which I'll preview now, which is, if you're listening to this and a lot of this resonates with you and you don't necessarily want to be political about it, what do you do? Like, what do you do as a person or a CEO? Like, what's the next step to prompt something positive? So be thinking about that. But Craig, why don't you weigh in on your top 2 or 3 actionable solutions you hope appear, policy or otherwise, and then we'll just cap it up with an answer to that last question.
Yeah, I think from a policy perspective, creating, especially tax policy, that's my area of practice, that encourages investment and growth. I think that should be front and center. California has one of the worst incentive packages amongst the different states. So again, when we do site selection and companies are evaluating one state versus another, California, we come in low. Our taxes are high. The different packages that we can offer are low. There's a lot of friction to doing business here. And I think if we could reduce that friction, that would help a lot, preserving our tax base and even growing our tax base. Everything we talk about, we talk about the exodus, it's actually pushing our tax base out of California. If you look at where California gets its tax revenues, a huge portion of it comes from personal income taxes. And those personal income taxes are coming from the top 1%. And so, if the exodus is not as people describe, if the exodus is though happening at that top 1%, that is going to have a disproportionate impact on how our budgets get met going forward. And so if we continue to make policy that alienates that top 1%, where else is California going to get that money from? Eventually they have to turn and look to other pools of taxpayers. And unfortunately at that point, if the jobs are all moving, where does that leave us? So I think we got to fix it. We got to address that.
Great. And so we have 30 seconds left, aside from a thank you and the fact that we will package up these Q&A and comments and include it in an after link so people can access it, because I think the questions in the comments were as valuable as all of our discussion. The final thing that individuals should do if they're on this panel and they want to see something happen or change that's within their power. Craig, I'm going to have you do it first, like 10 or 15 seconds. If there's a takeaway action item, you can say, listen to my previous comment or something new. And then Tom, you'll wrap up and then we'll be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of variables. I think it's don't bury your head in the sand. Let's be proactive. Let's be leaders here. Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley for a reason, a lot of which we talked about, and just let's capitalize on those reasons and hit this head on. Let's not just quietly let it lead us.
Tom, you get final word.
A lot of the problems we've discussed today stem from monopoly in politics. We can undo that monopoly in politics. We have something in California called the top 2 primary. I noticed Todd Harris in the comment section said the two parties don't elect centrists, but we can, because if you make it past the primary, only 2 candidates on the ballot in November, one a Democrat, one a common sense party, or one a Democrat, one an independent. Then people who are troubled about voting for Republicans can vote for somebody else. All it takes is 7 out of 80. If we flip 7 of the 80 assembly districts, then it brings the Democratic supermajority below 2/3. and then they can't increase taxes because it takes 2/3 to increase taxes, and they can't put initiatives like abolishing Prop 13 on the ballot without getting a single signature. So it is achievable. 7 out of 80 seats can be switched, and you do it through a third party.
So I want to thank you both, and I'll end with a kind of optimistic glass half full observation, which is, California is a wonderful place because we have a lot to lose and a lot to build on, right? There's such tremendous achievement and potential historically, and it's a great place where very smart, high achieving people can reasonably disagree about pretty tough problems, and this is one of those. So I appreciate both of you taking your time to share with us information. There'll certainly be lots of follow-on, and I particularly want to thank our attendees for posing lots of great questions, some of which we got to, some of which we didn't. I'll provide those to the panelists in case you want to engage around that. And we'll certainly have some follow-ups on this one way or another. And I want to very much thank, our partner in this, which, it was great to have ACG to be, a part of, helping us inform the views and pull in some great panelists, and then of course, pull in some wonderful audience. So thank you very much. And we'll talk to you both again soon, I'm sure.